40 years ago, rock was a very dominant genre in mainstream music. Bands like Queen, Led Zeppelin, The Eagles, Pink Floyd, and AC/DC were considered legends. And new bands were constantly bubbling up to the surface. However, around 10 or 15 years ago, rock started to fade into the background, while other genres like rap and country started getting more and more attention. So, what exactly happened? And is rock music just a thing of the past at this point? The erasure of rock was set in motion when music transitioned into the digital format, with services like Napster and iTunes becoming the mainstream way of consuming music. Many small labels handled this transition poorly and often failed to survive. Those who did survive basically lost control of the market and had their influence on all things music reduced. This pushed major record labels towards low investment but high yield artists since 2005 or so. The three most popular genres for this are rap, country, and crossover pop music. So, a label can sign a rapper with some buzz in an area via mixtapes or on SoundCloud for little money, and they have a built-in audience and likely some songs ready to go. They can easily recoup the investment from this in sales or streams just from that fan base alone. They then can use some promotional tools to see if it can cross over into a mainstream audience. If it blows up, you make bank. If it doesn't, they still haven't lost much money. It doesn't matter if the next record is a hit or not. If it fails, they can drop them and go on to the next rapper. Country music works much the same way. You have an artist or a group that has a built-in audience. Country fans, like rap, are constantly looking for new artists and still buy music by large. The crossover music star is the most limited but also the most lucrative at the moment. So a label can sign a television or movie star to make an album. It can cost them anywhere from a reasonable to an obscene amount of money depending on the level of star. They can put together an album to take advantage of the actor's next project so they can perform the album while out on promoting their project. It is almost a certain hit and a good return on investment. This formula has proven so effective that labels actively work on trying to get their artists that have potential to get into acting just to help create even more hits. Now, let's compare this to a rock band. They can have anywhere from 3 to 8 members, which means more people to try and keep happy. The costs to make a rock record and for artist development are astronomical in comparison. Rock music fans are also the least likely to spend money on music, and most bands usually release multiple albums before they get a hit, if they ever do, which by label standards now is unacceptable. This actually started as early as the 1990s during the grunge boom. Every band was getting massive offers from labels for years, for most of them to release records that massively underperformed to the standards labels were expecting, and many were dropped soon after. To further complicate matters, promoting new music is incredibly hard, especially rock. 3 entities pretty much own nearly all radio stations in the US, and in most markets there is nearly zero content on the radio being produced locally. That means you have a talent and engineer in a studio in New York City or LA putting out the feed via syndication to dozens of stations around the country. This is incredibly lucrative, as eliminating talent costs and employing a couple of ad sales guys and someone to check on the station's transmitter and equipment means the costs are almost non-existent. The downside is the ratings and influence of radio is almost non-existent as well. To give you an idea of how influential radio once was, just ask your parents or grandparents if they knew talent and shows on their local stations. Most likely they did. So, as the influence of the radio eroded, so has one of the best ways to help break a new artist. Then you have the MTV problem. As MTV moved away from music in the late 90s and early 2000s, they also took away a major pipeline for labels to be able to push new acts and promote new releases. For many who didn't grow up in the 80s and 90s, it cannot be understated enough how influential and important MTV was to artists. If you were a new artist and your video got played on MTV, even on a niche show like 120 Minutes or Yo MTV Raps, that translated into thousands of sales. Getting played in regular rotation meant you were almost certainly going to have a massive selling record. YouTube, on the other hand, has enabled people to watch nearly any music video they want on demand. But discovery and curation, much like with radio, is a big issue. Without the money and promotional tools, it is very hard to break a new artist. You also have fewer rock bands being formed and playing due to the last and arguably the most crucial issue. The small music club scene in the US is almost entirely gone. Back in the early 2000s, a band could do a tour and could play a small venue in nearly any city in the US and normally leave with some profit to allow them to keep going on. Today, however, if you are an up-and-coming band looking to play a 250 to 1200 seat venue, your options are basically non-existent today. Rising rents, gentrification, lower interest in live music, and ownership retiring or dying have killed most of them. Even in the largest cities like New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, you have a handful of venues, and getting booked is not easy as they get a ton of requests and have limited dates available. Things like veteran for war halls and shelter houses that were used by punk and indie bands in the 1990s and 2000s are increasingly gone as well due to ownership refusing to book music or being sold for developments. If you look at the bands that headline most music festivals, it is the same people who headlined these things 20-ish years ago as well, since the industry has not been able to produce stars deemed big enough to do such things on their own. Most music venues are owned by big music promoters, or worse, ticketing companies. They increasingly offer big money to older bands from the 90s and 2000s that broke up to reform and try and fill the medium venues they own. It can be lucrative for both, but it is also indicative that the industry is unable to create new stars and is relying on old acts to try and drive profit. Now, is this all fixable? Yes, it is. I am utterly amazed someone hasn't created an internet-based MTV alternative. I am also amazed that none of the big streaming services have tried to do a more live curated feed. Getting radio ownership into smaller and local hands would transform radio overnight, frankly. Hopefully, as more employers learn to embrace working from home and give up the need for offices in expensive urban areas, you will see real estate prices in cities starting to drop and make small venues viable once again. It's very easy to tell if a particular recording was recorded a long time ago. In this video, we explain why that is the case. Don't forget to like and subscribe.